Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club. My name is Keith Bradsher. I'm the Hong Kong bureau chief for the New York Times, and I'll be your host as first vice president of the club. Let me introduce today's event, the reason you're here. Our speaker today, Anurag Viswanath, is somebody who has looked at China as somebody from India. So often we hear, including many of our speakers, perhaps many of us foreign correspondents, look at China perhaps through Western eyes. She has tried to give us an Indian's perspective on China. She did her doctorate at Fudan University, so she's somebody who in Shanghai, so she's somebody who really knows China in depth. And she's also now published a book, which you can buy on your way out if you wish, Finding India in China, Travels to the Lesser Known. She's somebody who's particularly looked at the periphery of India, and that's going to be her subject today. Those on the periphery, both in the physical sense of in outlying areas and also on the periphery of Chinese society. With that, I give you Anurag. Thank you.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So in 2001, I stepped out of India for the first time in my life. I was on my way to Fudan University in Shanghai. There was a brief stopover at Hong Kong. So technically speaking, Hong Kong was the first foreign country that I ever set my foot on. I was absolutely amazed and excited by what I saw in Hong Kong and how different it was from Delhi. It was with a pang of regret, a twinge of remorse, that I felt that India was far, far behind. The reason I was going to Fudan was to do my PhD, my fieldwork on Gansu province, the poorest province in China. Tingxi County had been identified as my area for fieldwork. And of course, I had to start with Chinese language. So I joined Fudan Tashui, and one day Lao She came to class. She wanted a few volunteers to teach the Chinese students at Fudan English. The Belgian in class volunteered. The German in class volunteered. And I, as an Indian, also volunteered to teach English. She turned around, looked at me, and said, "You don't get it, do you? We want a native speaker teaching English." Since the last decade and a half, China has been on my mind. I've traveled to Tingxi, which is one of the poorest counties in China, to big cities, and Lao She was right. I don't look at China through the eyes of a native speaker. I look at China through Indian eyes with an Indian perspective. I carry with me perhaps the history, the baggage of history, the baggage of war, the 1962 war, from 1962 up until 1988, absolute and complete diplomatic and political logjam between India and China. I carry with me the baggage of my skin color, but most of all, I carry this very happy baggage of centuries of long civilizational connections between India and China, which is China's most beloved classic. It's Shioji, Journey to the West, travels to lands which lay west of China, India. What about the Great Goose Pagoda at Xi'an? It houses the scriptures that the monk Xuanzang brought back from India. What about Tunhuang? The frescoes of Tunhuang were said to have been inspired by India. And what about Ji Xianlin, the famous Indologist? It was Ji Xianlin who suggested that the dragon and the phoenix are Indian imports. In other words, the dragon is the flying naga, or this flying serpent, and the phoenix is an adaptation of the Garuda bird. This brings us all to today's talk, what the periphery tells us about China. It is extremely critical to understand China's economic miracle but it's also very important to be objective about China to help us understand it better. Periphery is very complicated. Defining it is extremely complex. When I grew up in the eastern city of Cuttack, a small little dusty town in eastern India, Cuttack was my center and Delhi was my periphery. When I moved to Shanghai, Shanghai became my center and Delhi became my periphery. So I use periphery in a very broad manner, and I beg the indulgence of the audience to carry me along in the due course of this talk. China, as you know, is homogeneous. 90% of the population is Han, and then the 55 others or the minorities. There is also the geographical periphery. Xinjiang, which is on the extreme western periphery of China. Xin, as you know, means new, and Jiang means dominion or territory, so new territory of China. Tibet, there's a lot of debate, a lot of controversy on Tibet. Was it unified? Was it liberated? Or was it occupied? Manchuria in the northeast part of China, and there's Inner Mongolia skirting Outer Mongolia. There is also the religious periphery. As you know, Xinjiang has the Uyghur Muslims, but China has 10 different Muslims, and the largest Muslim group are the Hui Muslims. China has, as the BBC estimates, almost 100 million Christians, and there is also a very small community of Jews in Kaifeng in central Henan. There is also China's social periphery. They're the migrants, more than 260 million, leaving the villages or the rural areas for the cities, and so they are hollowed out villages and the left behind children, and of course, the LGBT community, which is on the periphery. These are some of the core issues, these are some of the core themes that I've discussed in my book, Finding India and China. Travels to the lesser known implies travels to the peripheries of China. I'm very happy today to have here with me Daniel Ho, the editor of my book. It was Daniel? So it was Daniel who helped resolve the knots of my mind and bring the book to its logical conclusion. This, as you can see, is the Great Wall of China. It was Owen Lattimore who told us, the great scholar, the great traveler, that this was history's most absolute statement of the idea of the frontier. It demarcated the agrarian or the sedentary way of life from the nomadic way of life. As you can see from this map, it does not quite extend beyond Jiayuguan, or it doesn't extend north of Yinchuan. So the Chinese built the wall to protect what was theirs. This is a conceptual map of China. This is an illustrative map. When I first traveled in China, I went to a place which is very famous for the Leaning Tower of China. I forget its name. It's on the fringes of Shanghai, Leaning Tower of Pisa. So I went in search of the Leaning Tower of China. I went there and I found a lot of motorcycle taxis, and I had to take one of the motorcycle taxis, and one of the taxiwalas asked me where I was from. I said, "Can you take a guess?" And he looked at me and he said, "Your accent is not very good. You're probably from Xinjiang." Then on one of my first trips out of Shanghai, when I was going to Huangshan in Anhui province, one of the poorest provinces again of China, I met a lot of people on the train, fellow travelers, who offered me churro kan, like dried pork jerky, and I said that I was a Hindu and I did not eat pork. And one of the travelers who was observing me said, Indians and the Uyghurs are very similar. Both the Uyghurs and the Indians don't eat pork, and they use their hands to eat their food. So that is how I went to Xinjiang. This is a photograph that could be any other city in China. It could be Wuxi. it could be Hangzhou, it could be Suzhou, it could be Wuhan. This is a photograph that reminds you of iconic historian Wang Kungwu's observation that cities in China, most often than not, look like clones of each other. This is a photograph that I took from the top of the Red Hill in Urumqi. And as American demographer Stanley Tubb said or observed, Urumqi is pretty much a Han city. In 1949, the population of Xinjiang was 4.3 million. 76% were Uyghurs. In 2015, 40 to 45% of the population are the Uyghurs. Xinjiang also has the XPCC, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. It's also called the Pingtuan. 2.8 million people and 175 regiments. So from Urumqi, I wanted to go to Kashgar. And I was working with an organization in Urumqi, and I requested if they would help me go to Kashgar. And what they told me was very interesting. They told me that I was much better off going to Kashgar on my own. I also met a young man, a Chinese educated, a Chinese American educated young man in Kashgar. He had just graduated from Harvard. He came up to me in Kashgar and he told me that he wanted to tag along with me. This was also quite a revelation. The reason why he wanted to tag along with me was because he felt safer with me. So the demography of Kashgar is writ on its face. The demography of southern Xinjiang is writ on its face. 90% of the population are the Uyghurs. In the middle, picture one, you can see these beautiful old men wearing their badam caps, their dopa caps. Picture two, this is what restaurants in Kashgar look like, very Central Asian feel. You can see the copper samovar on the table. You can see the wooden latticed windows. You can see the tablecloth, which has more of a Central Asian feel. Picture three, this is this young lady who's standing in front of the tomb of Apak Khoja. Apak Khoja is the patron saint of Kashgar. It is also the mausoleum of Xiang Fei, Xiangkang the Xiang, the fragrant concubine. And as I passed by, this young lady shouted out and said, "Would you like to take a picture with me? I'm the modern day Xiang Fei." This is a picture of Kashgar, one of the oldest cities in Central Asia. And as you know, the old city is being systematically demolished, and a lot of the people are being moved into apartments that look like this. When I went to Kashgar, I saw a lot of women who still wear their burqa. And as of 2015, the burqa has been banned, the beard has been banned. Keeping the roza during Ramzan is also banned in Xinjiang. Every chapter of my book begins with a map, and this map indicates the intersection of a particular place in China with a particular place in India. In this case, Xinjiang with Kashmir. Both Xinjiang and Kashmir are troubled provinces. Both are adrift with rivers of blood. Both are Muslim majority provinces. Both are extremely restive. In the 1980s and 1990s, this is what Kashmir looked like. Kashmir was burning. You would often see the army bunkers. You would often see houses which were gutted by separatists. You would see open violence in the street. Today, even if you're the worst critic of Kashmir, you will concede that Kashmir is healing or Kashmir is on the mend. So Kashmir is beginning to heal. There are a lot of tourists who are coming back to the shikaras. Kashmir is very famous for the shikaras, or the houseboats that ply on the Dal Lake. There are a lot of tourists who are coming back to the ski slopes. There are a lot of tourists who are returning to the walnut forests and cherry orchards. So there have been elections in 2014. And I was interested to understand from a personal point of view as to why Kashmir is on the mend and why is Xinjiang still burning. Well, Kashmir has an Article 370 in the Constitution, which prevents Indians from other parts of India from buying property and settling in Kashmir. In other words, there has been no demographic tinkering of the magnitude that has happened elsewhere. Secondly, there is no equivalent of the XPCC, 2.8 million people sent to rebuild and reconstruct the frontier. That has not happened in Kashmir. Just a couple of years ago, there was this very powerful film. It was a mainstream film. It was called Haidar. A lot of people wanted the movie to be banned. Somebody said any movie that sympathizes with terrorists needs to go to the bin. The director was accused of being an anti-national. He turned around and said, "I'm not anti-national, but I'm not anti-human either." In other words, open discussion, open debate, and acceptance has been very critical for the healing process in Kashmir. The Mongols were once the nomads. They were the nomads who followed water and grass. They were lovingly called the traveling ethnicity, Mape Minzu, or a nation on horseback. What has happened to the Mongols in Inner Mongolia? Well, there 1 in 5 is a Mongol, a very slim minority, 20% of the population. If you go to Hohhot, which is the capital of Inner Mongolia, picture 1, you'll see a lot of signboards, Chinese calligraphy, as well as the Mongol script. If you go to some of the shops, you will be able to buy Mongol souvenirs. It's quite ironic that the Mongols were once the outsiders who lived outside the Great Wall. But Chinggis Khan has now been appropriated as a Chinese national hero, and he wears a Chinese cap. If you go to the grasslands, you will gather a sense of the displacement, social and economic displacement of the nomads. Picture 1, it's of a nomad turned farmer, turned entertainer. A lot of the grasslands in Mongolia has been divvied up. You can see picture 2. A lot of the grasslands has been divvied up into tourist zones where tourists come to partake in grassland tourism. So this herder turned farmer turned entertainer now plays the matochin, which is the horse-headed fiddle, for the tourists who come. I interviewed a herder. His name was Tamrin. He told me that the Mongols and the Chinese were the same people, just in case I did not know. He was also a nomad turned farmer turned entrepreneur. He had a stack of satin clothes, and he had a couple of horses, which he rented out to the tourists. He made me wear the satin outfit, and there I was looking pretty much like Exhibit A. The Mongols were once the terrifying warriors who lived outside of the Great Wall. But hearing this herder's story, it made me realize, it made me understand that some of them are indeed today, in today's China, in times of globalization, market, and tourism, are indeed less than terrifying. This could be a very pretty girl. She's wearing an Indian lehenga. She's wearing elaborate Indian jewelry. She even has a bindi on her forehead. She could be a very pretty Indian girl or Indian bride, but she's actually a Hui Muslim. This is a picture that I took in Xining, the capital of Qinghai. So China has a lot of Hui Muslims, more than 10 million Hui Muslims. The relationship that the Han have with the Hui is non-conflictual. But the relationship that the Uyghurs have with the Han is conflictual. So the Hui Muslims, they look very Chinese, and they speak Chinese. They were born out of the intermarriage of the Arab and the Persian traders who came to China in the 7th and 8th century. A lot of the Hui Muslims are like the Muslims in any other part of the world. They want to read the Quran 5 times a day. They want to eat halal food or Xinjiang food. And they aspire to go for the Hajj. This is a picture again of a bride, but if you notice very carefully, she's standing in the courtyard of a mosque. So the Hui Muslims are not in conflict with the Han. A lot of them now follow folk rituals. A lot of them have Chinese names like Wang or Yang, although some of them do have very Hui surnames such as Ma or Sai or He or Ha. A lot of them have actually taken to an ancestor worship. And very interesting, when you see the Hui Muslims in the coastal part of China, a lot of them also eat pork. So, in other words, the Hui Muslims straddle the Muslim world, but they increasingly straddle the Han world. Sexuality is very complicated. In the early 2000s, homosexuality was considered a mental illness or mental disease, but it was decriminalized. One of the foremost spokespersons has been Li Yinhe. This is what the New York Times, which ran a story, sex expert's secret is out and China's open to it, who has openly admitted that her partner is a transgender man and she is not a lesbian. As some of you know, it was Sir Ian who threw his weight behind the Shanghai Pride. If you actually Google Bangalore Pride, there are chances that Pride Hotel Bangalore is going to come up with a 3-star rating on TripAdvisor. So India decriminalized homosexuality and recriminalized it again, quite different from China. Most of you are aware that one of the stories that attracted a lot of attention was the marriage of these 2 young men in Changsha, a very small city in Hunan. And of course, there is the remarkable story of Jinxing, a colonel in the army who bent it like Beckham long before Bruce Jenner or Caitlyn Jenner did. In the 1990s, Jinxing underwent a gender reassignment surgery. She learned to dance under Martha Graham. She is a very well-known dancer and choreographer, and she is very popular, one of the celebrities, so much so that even the Communist Party vies for her attention. And finally, migrants. In 2000, there were about 121 million migrants. In 2016, there are about 277 million. In fact, if you go to a city such as Shanghai or Beijing or any of the SEZs, you'll often find migrants sitting by the zebra crossing with placards saying Shui Kung or Mu Kung, woodwork or waterwork. One of the films which captured the angst and anxiety of the migrants was The Last Train Home. It was a film made by Li Xin-fan, which explored the angst of the left behind children and the elderly guardians, about 60 million left behind children and 20 to 30 million elderly in the rural areas. So the migrants are an underclass, they're second-class citizens, and unlike any other periphery, they're not geographically delimited. The numbers are not very trivial, and China's preoccupation has always been one thing, or stability. And so the migrants are everywhere. China now has a new urbanization plan, and today, China is 50% rural, more or less 50% urban. Out of that, 35% of the urban citizens have the hukou, because after 1978, the relaxation of the hukou unleashed the largest internal migration in history. So by 2020, they plan to reach the hukou to 45% of the urban population. But this does not come cheap. This does not come for free. The cost to regularize somebody with hukou, this is an estimate by scholars of the National University of Singapore, very, very high. There is also the problem of integrating the rural areas with the urban areas, as well as the sustainability of all the new cities that are going to come up. About 200 cities with a population of more than 1 million by 2030. So what does the periphery tell us about China? There are about 10 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang. There are about a little more than 10 million Hui Muslims scattered in the northwestern part of China. Tibetans, more than 4 million. Mongols, less than 10 million. And who is the largest periphery in China? It's the migrants. When you look at the Hui Muslims, or if you look at the Jews, if you look at the Hui Muslims, or if you look at the Jews, there has been a lot of thrust on assimilation or homogenization. I'm not here to say whether China is right or wrong. That is beyond my competence. But I'm here to say that the way China integrates, the way China embraces, the way China co-opts, the way China assimilates, it's a very different way of doing with respect to India. A lot of it is my way, the Han way, or the highway. So the focus or the tendency is on homogenization. The largest and most pressing periphery, again, they're not the Uyghurs, they're not the Tibetans, not the Mongols, not the Hui Muslims, but it's the migrants. It is often said that India is a democracy, but one scholar in India said that India is open, but it's closed. China is closed, but it's open. And especially with respect to the LGBT community, you can see in China that there is a lot of popular acceptance in society. And so the LGBT are accepted liberally and have found a place. Thank you.
As you were looking at Kashmir, you said a couple of things maybe that helped bring peace to Kashmir. One was openness of discussion. Another was that the demography had not been changed, and yet Kashmir had the additional challenge of the division between India and Pakistan, and the additional challenge of state-financed activity by Pakistan. Why then, without that kind of activity, is Xinjiang so much worse? You think it's entirely the immigration, or is it also is it primarily the immigration, or is it primarily the lack of open discussion, the ability to discuss and resolve issues openly?
Do you want me to take a bunch
Please.
of questions?
Yeah.
Or? Well, what I'm suggesting is that it's a combination of all the reasons that I mentioned. But open discussion in a democratic milieu certainly helps, and it certainly helps in healing. And the fact that the demography was not tinkered with has also helped in Kashmir. There is a lot of anger in Xinjiang, because if you look at Xinjiang, it can actually be divided into northern Xinjiang, which is largely integrated, and southern Xinjiang, where the demography is otherwise. So southern Xinjiang is still Uyghur majority, but northern Xinjiang is very Han or very Cynic. So there is a lot of
And
resentment.
is southern Xinjiang more peaceful?
Southern Xinjiang is burning. So
So
northern
it has not had the demographic change, and yet it's burning.
Well, there has increasingly, if you see in the last 5 years, you see that there is going to be a Kashgar special economic zone. You also see that a lot of things are, such as, the beard or the burqa, stand banned. You also have the systematic demolition of the old city that's in Kashgar, and a lot of the people are being moved into new apartments. This is what was done in Beijing in the 50s. If some of us here might have read Jianing Cha, who observed that the city walls of Beijing were systematically dismantled, and they went in the making of the anti-air raid tunnels that lie underneath Beijing. So widening roads, building a skyscraper, that has happened in other parts of China, but the cultural insensitivity, especially with respect to the old city, which is one of the oldest cities in Central Asia, I think most of you would have a point of view on that.
Okay. Over here, please.
One thing you didn't mention is the caste system, where you have democracy, but you have a very socially very anti-democratic system in place. Whereas in China, there's a lot of social mobility, regardless of your background. Poor peasant can become the president. In fact, most of the leaders come from that background. So I'd like you to comment on that, because you did leave out what I think is a very important aspect of Indian life, and that's the caste system.
I'm actually very delighted that you asked me this question, and let me take you back to to a body of work by a Chinese American scholar, Fei-Ling Wang, who has very specifically explored the relation between caste system in India and the hukou in China. And it is Fei-Ling Wang who contends that China has a caste system, and that caste system is hukou. And the reason why he says so is both caste and hukou are age-old systems. The hukou actually goes back to the Paujia system, centuries old. Two, both are by virtue of birth. Both are inherited. Caste is inherited, and so is hukou. Both are forms of control, and both function as an internal passport. It was only in 1978 that Deng Xiaoping relaxed the hukou system. So actually there is a process by which a rural hukou can be made into a urban hukou. But then again, you have American geographers such as Cindy Fan, who says that it actually, it is only the creamy layer in rural China which is able to access urban hukou, either by buying property or by having specific skills which are needed in the urban areas. Coming back to caste, there is also a process which has been much chronicled in India. It's called the process of Sanskritization. This is what a sociologist, a very eminent Indian sociologist, discussed, whereby a lower caste can actually take a surname of a higher caste and thereby become an upper caste. So technically speaking, there are ways that a lower caste can become a higher caste, or a rural hukou can become an urban hukou. But in both the systems, there is a lot of bureaucracy. There is a lot of bureaucracy, and like I have discussed in my book, today, both in India and China, the bottom line is not hukou, the bottom line is not caste, but the bottom line is Qian Shang, Mr. Money. So if it is affluence that has that has negated or is now considered as one of um, it is affluence that bridges the gap between the rich and the poor, be it India or in China. But if I actually have to differentiate between India and China, I'd probably have to go back to economists Jean Drèze or Amartya Sen, who have specifically focused on the economic miracle in China, but they say that the economic miracle in China was based on the backs of what was achieved during Mao's time. So 1949 to 1976, you have the basic need strategy or you have the support-led strategy. So the focus was on immunization, the focus was on literacy, on sanitation and access to clean water. In India, there were no land reforms, no egalitarian distribution of land, except in 2 states. And literacy, immunization, which made the basis of the iconic Judith Bannister book, China's Changing Population Has Not Happened in India. So in India, the economic reforms, as much as we all want economic reforms, but without literacy, without immunization, access to clean water, sanitation, it's still a very long road for India.
We have time for one more question. Back here, please.
Thank you. I'm Jan Leno from the Australian Consulate. Thank you for that very interesting presentation. There's 2 sort of global demographic questions that I wonder if you could comment on in terms of their effects on the peripheral populations that you mentioned. One being the aging of the Chinese population and the second being the gender imbalance. Thank you.
Yes, there is one thing that India and China have in common, which is a son preference, and that is not something which India or China are very proud of. And as for the aging population, by 2050, China is going to have a massive number of aging. Labor costs are already very high, and India still has a young population. India still has a lot of population in the working group. But if you have a population without education, without skills, without opportunities, because in China, it was agrarian reforms, industrial reforms, it was public relief works which created opportunities for employment. But in India, you have a huge working age population, and the India is still an economy which is trying to consume its way to prosperity. It's the services sector, but manufacturing is still very hazy, and infrastructure and connectivity are roadblocks in India's development. So that has not happened in the Indian case.
Thank you very much.